Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening. Can you hear me? Yeah. I've got this weird contraption. I've never had one of these before, so I'm getting used to it. Thank you for, I believe there was some tube delays, so thank you for fighting through that. For our main speaker, Hussein Kasvani. He's, as we heard, promoting this book. It's been out for how many months now?
It came out in May, so
it
hasn't been that long, but it's felt like a really long time.
It does feel, yeah, absolutely. Follow me, Akhi, that's brother in Arabic, the online world of British Muslims. The book is I would describe it as a journey into the sometimes weird, but often wonderful world of the British Muslim community. And in his book, it's a tour de force. You learn about Muslim Tinder and Sheikh Ghul. You hear about anti-Muslim trolling and about the red pill fantasizing, matrix-loving Manosphere. It's quite an interesting inquiry into the British Muslim community. As somebody working in policy, I see a lot of, sad to say, nonsense written about British Muslim communities and British Muslims, usually through the prism of extremism. And yes, Hussein does cover that elephant in the room, and he talks to, and I'm sure we'll be hearing about Abu Antar, the Arsenal supporting ISIS fighter, who talks to Hussein via WhatsApp. But as Hussein said in his own words, the internet is a crucial component to what contemporary British Muslim communities are like. And I'm looking forward to speaking to him about that. A brief description about Hussein's life so far. In his book, he talks about what many journalists, when they join up to be, not just the Bob Woodwards of this world, but also, in Hussein's words, a crack Westminster lobby journalist. But his career took him to reporting on British Muslims. He's been a journalist, editor, and producer. Currently, you're the European editor of Mel magazine. And he's covered the Muslim beat and other beats at Buzzfeed, Vice, and of course, The Guardian. That's where you started, right?
I interned a lot
You
for a
interned
long time,
a lot
so.
Before you developed your byline.
Yeah, it first took a very long time to get there.
I guess I've got to ask the cliche question.
Yeah, sure.
Why did you write the book?
Why? I asked myself that as well. So there was two things. So I was reporting on Muslim communities at Buzzfeed from 2015 to 2016. And it was a bit of a weird one because it was like BuzzFeed News in the UK had just developed, and their kind of thing was like, we want to get more people to cover areas of British life that other newspapers and other media organizations aren't doing. So one of them was LGBTQ, the other one was on kind of like Afro-Caribbean communities, and there was one where it's like, we want to kind of, we want to cover Muslim communities in Britain, and we're not quite sure what that means, but we want you to kind of work that out. And at the time, I was working as a producer, and I was not happy with my job, and I was looking for any way out. So when I was offered this job at BuzzFeed, I was like, I don't know. And then they said that like there's a snack room. And I was like, yes, we're going to do that.
They asked you?
Yeah.
To cover the Muslim beat.
Yeah, and they kind of sold me with the snack room. So I was like, okay, let's do this. I was very reluctant to a degree because I was kind of like, this could go horribly wrong.
Did you feel you might be typecast?
Yeah, and I kind of knew that I would be as well. And I also knew that in the course of like approaching me, they were like typecasting me. But there was also a part of me that was like, okay, this is like a big opportunity to maybe change things, because I get so frustrated when I read stories about Muslim communities and people like me who are either like extremists or they're people who are doing insane amounts of charity work to prove that they're not extremists. And it seemed to be this weird dichotomy, and I was kind of like, I've spent a lot of my time on the internet, and I've spent a lot of my kind of formative years online. And I know that like there is this huge spectrum of like how
when you say a lot of your time,
more
than most, or
more than most, still to this day more than most, right? In a way that like frustrates a lot of people. But I also knew that in the course of that, like, okay, there's some really interesting communities and some really interesting stories And no one's really telling them, and maybe they're not telling them because they don't know where they are, or maybe they're not telling those nuanced stories because the platforms that exist in the country, whether it's like on the BBC or whether it's on newspapers, aren't kind of providing the space to do that. So maybe I could go do that. And to an extent, I think I did. Like, I was able to kind of cover stories about, like, FOSIS, which is like the big Muslim students union. I was able to kind of cover stories about conservative Muslim, like more conservative leaning Muslims in ways that weren't like these people are extremists, but like these are people who actually like have quite life struggles, and this is how they're dealing with like particular policies, or even kind of stories about like integration and housing and stuff, and how that fit into like largely Muslim areas. So I think I was able to do some good work, but the kind of issue always emerged, which was like, what stories are technically quote unquote newsworthy? And I don't know how many of you have read the book, but in the book, almost all the stories in here were things that were just not considered to be newsworthy. So many of them were just like things that I would pitch to a news desk, and they were like, no, not quite. So I kind of kept them in like a back of a notebook. And then when I left BuzzFeed, I took that notebook with me. I was like, and I showed Michael at Hearst, like, I've got all these things, and I think they're still really important, but I don't know what to do with them. And he was the one who was like, well, maybe you should write a book about it. And that's how it emerged. So for me, it was kind of like, I wanted to kind of continue writing those stories. I knew it was there, and I also knew that like, I was probably one of the only people who had such an intimate knowledge of the internet and like about internet culture to be able to write that in a way that would give the people involved in these stories justice, like regardless of where they came from.
When did you realize that the internet was the golden thread that connected the story?
I think just because almost all the stories involve some sort of social media device, and like, I think it makes sense if you think about it, like so much of our lives are like integrated on the internet. So whenever we're spreading political messages, we're talking about how are these political messages being sent on WhatsApp or like Telegram or whatever. When we're talking about like things to do with social justice, like a lot of social justice movements begin as Facebook groups, or they begin as Twitter hashtags, and then they become something else. And I think for a long time, lots of news people have seen the internet as like this abstract thing. It's like this secondary thing where like things in the real world don't happen. And I think when you've grown up online, and when so much of your formative years happen on the internet, you sort of realize that no, actually this is a really integral part of the human experience, and like especially experiences for young people who don't feel like they belong in any particular like material clique, or like that the material world doesn't have much to offer them. Like they can kind of create and fashion out their own spaces. So many questions about identity generally happen on the internet, and my thing was just like, well, with Muslim identity, it's the same. So why is it that whenever I'm seeing reports about Muslims, like they're always sending like some white bloke out to Bradford to like, interview some random people on the street? Like it doesn't make sense to me.
I think one of the things I've found in your book is you allow, there's a lot of interesting characters in the book, as we mentioned in the opening in the opening introduction, characters that you tell about their online world.
Yeah.
How does it differ from yours? Or what was the most striking differences you found?
I think in some ways it was really similar. So like as a reporter, like obviously your life is very different because you take a distance away from your source, and you're curious about like how does your source move through the world, and how do they use their social platforms to kind of fashion out an identity for themselves. And I'm also I was reporting on this from the ages of 26 to 28. So the book came out just before my 28th birthday. So I was also like older than most of the sources in my book. So I knew that my internet experience would be like very different. So even though some of the principles were the same, i.e. like with, on the chapter with like gamers and, trolls and stuff, I knew that like these are people who are finding communities. So they're going to places where they can find communities of people where they can play video games with, but also talk about like big issues in their lives. I know with like the sillier stories about like a woman who is desperately searching on various like fatwa websites about whether or not she can eat chicken that is not technically halal, but might be. So if you have that inclination, like what's like what are the rulings of that, and like how can I find one that like sort of suits me? I was writing this kind of in the shadow of like lots of British people, young British people going over to Syria or having regrets about going to Syria and coming back, and this underlining thing about really what this was a search for identity, and it was one where in the country that you're in and in a family that you're in, like you're kind of told, well, this is who you are as a Muslim. Like, you know, you were born into like a, you know, say East African Shia family, so this is who you're supposed to be. But a person being like, well, this isn't who I am, like my experiences are very different, and there's no one really engaging with that. They're kind of just saying, well, this is the truth, or this is who you are. So you're going to go to alternative sources, and you're going to find alternative people to like figure that out. I think the red pill stuff and the Manosphere things, like the Muslim Jordan Peterson fans.
Do you want to just explain?
Yeah, I mean,
to the uninitiated here.
You know, so this, you know, to kind of put it shortly, like there's this thing online called the Manosphere where it's kind of like lots of men's rights activists who sort of believe that like feminism has like ruined their lives. And there's lots of variations of men, but in kind of like a subset of that are religious men who believe that like a return to traditionalism and traditional patriarchal values will like, you know, seed out corruption. And the issue is that like feminism doesn't, you know, feminism is like antithetical to religion. So this is like where the Muslim groups fit in, where it's like, yeah, like, you know, this growth of like outspoken Muslim women on Twitter who keep like telling me that I'm an idiot are actually doing so because they've been like empowered by Western ideology. And, you know, this red pill community of people who technically don't like me, because a lot of these a lot of them are like Christian red pillars who believe that like immigration is kind of like deteriorated Europe and and had turned all the churches into like, you know, betting shops or whatever. You know, so for them, like they find like, so, you know, for the Muslim red pillars that I spoke to, they were like, we're willing to look past that sense. We're willing to like look past them not liking us because we believe. Do they
call themselves Muslim red pillars?
No, I mean, they kind of, you know, some of them, you know, the guy I interviewed who thought he was very clever was like, no, actually, I just call myself a Muslim because Islam is like the true red pill, so I don't need to call myself that. But it's like, well, you also hang out with guys who call themselves red pillars, so, you know, that's kind of by the by. That's also another really interesting thing, which is that like they were so adamant not to compartmentalize themselves, but like they were doing so in terms of who they were choosing to interact with, whose voices they were choosing to amplify, who they chose to have on their podcasts, etc., etc. So they were making these choices which like, you know, were able to fit into particular internet subcultures, but they were still insistent that what they were doing was just kind of going back to traditional Muslim values which would have existed with or without the internet anyway.
I don't want to dwell on extremism, but it's, as I said earlier, it is an elephant in the room. Isn't the Muslim experience with the internet and extremism simply the same experience, just with amplified further, given the challenge we have? I mean, you know, the search for identity, the search for counterculture, not just extremism, but, you know, alternative, you know, the red pillar guy in the 90s wouldn't have necessarily have the internet, but he'd have watched The Matrix and looked for Jordan Peterson's in other ways.
I think like at the core of this book, every character in it was looking for like a sense of identity, in a sense that they were trying to answer these questions as to like, who am I? But they were doing so in this context of like the state kind of giving them a definition of who they should be or who they are. Their families kind of saying, you know, these are your obligations and these are your like responsibilities, so this is who you are. And, you know, Abu Anta is like a really interesting story because this is a guy who did all the right things by his, like, you know, Asian family, right? Like, he got a good degree, he got a job in the city, you know, he was a semi-practicing Muslim, which, like, by all measures was probably a good thing for, like, his parents who were like, you know, well, he practices the faith, so, like, I've done my job. You know, but inside he's kind of like, I just feel really dissatisfied. Like, I feel dissatisfied that like this religion that my parents brought me up in isn't giving me the spiritual fulfillment that I want. And in that sense, it's like he's searching for something else, and he's searching for like a way for his religion to mean something. And I think what's interesting, I've just thought about this now, is like in the opening chapter of the book, I speak to two men who have stopped going to Jummah prayers, and they've decided to like hold their own prayer in their flat. And what they do is they kind of decide the subject that they want to listen to. So say it might be climate change, or it might be economics, or it might be the situation in like, you know, Gaza and like Palestine. And they'll say that, okay, we're going to watch a YouTube video. It doesn't necessarily have to be an Islamic YouTube video, but we're going to listen to it for like 10 minutes. We're going to like take from it like the things that we want, and then we're going to do Jummah prayer together afterwards, and then go get food, right? And for them, it was like, you know, we went to like Friday prayers for so long, and we weren't getting anything from it. We used to sit there and like listen to like an imam kind of say that, you know, we need to wash our feet in a certain way, or we need to act towards our parents in a particular way. We just weren't getting anything from it. and they had read like a particular hadith, which was like, said something along the lines of, during Friday prayers, like the Prophet or like one of the companions would say, would use the Friday prayer to talk about like social justice, and would talk about like spreading the faith through means of social justice, and they were basically trying to reenact that using the kind of tools that they had. Now, whether that's kind of like Islamically correct is not necessarily my job to decipher. There are lots of controversies around like what Jummah prayer should be, but for them it was like, I just feel this great dissatisfaction with the way that authorities in my masjid or like in my Muslim community are kind of disseminating the faith, and I'm going to take control of it myself. So it's almost this way of like, not necessarily undermining, but kind of saying that like, just because you are an authority by nature of like your position does not necessarily mean that I have to treat you as one.
I guess why I was asking is my experience in the 90s of radicalization and extremism. It was part of that. I'm rebelling against my parents', in many cases Asian version of Islam, and one of them is I may join. And there was various types of groups at the time as well. You had your Hizb ut-Tahrir, your Al-Muhajiroons, you had depending which communities from Nation of Islam, and you would say, right, well, I'm not. There was one occasion where he said, right, I'm not going to start wearing shoes in the mosque, or those kind of things. And so there are a lot of parallels there, and also there were also debates around technology as well, as in you had the khutbah and the sermon and the prayer broadcast on those AV radios, which were sold at mosque. And there was a debate about, well, is your prayer valid if you follow the imam from the mosque from your home? So I guess what I'm saying is that is technology just simply a continuation of this sort of thread of grappling with how one deals with identity and community?
Yeah, I mean, there's always like identity, like throughout history, there's always like identity crises, right? And like the best stories that you hear come from a place of like people like searching for themselves. I kind of say sometimes that like a lot of these books are just like a collection of coming of age stories that we often afford to like young white men, and like there's like in a whole like film genre of like young men who kind of go on an adventure that maybe they shouldn't go, and like by the end of it they kind of grow as people. Like that's a coming of age story. And in this case it's like, well, these are also young men who are kind of looking for answers, and by the time these stories end, like, okay, maybe they haven't resolved these issues, but maybe they've learned a little bit more about themselves in the process. They've kind of decided, well, this is the type of religion that like I'm comfortable with. Sometimes it's the case with like the ex-Muslims where, they've just made this big decision to like leave Islam completely, but they realize that like the nature of like their race or their name, for example, means that they never quite leave it in the eyes of the state. And how do you kind of grapple with that? And this stuff has been, this stuff has existed, forever. But like the thing about the tech that we have, and especially with like social media, where everything is supposed to be so public and so visible, means that like more people are having to see these things and then having to react to these things. Like back in the 90s and like the early like stages of the internet, I think everything was compartmentalized. So you would have like, forums, and you would have message boards, and if you were interested in like one subject, then you would go to that message board, but if you weren't really that interested, you wouldn't go. And now it's changed because everyone has basically migrated to Facebook, or they've migrated to Twitter or Instagram, or like TikTok, or whatever like social media platform that you're on, depending on what age you are. So now if you're on Facebook, for example, and you want to have like a conversation in a thread, like everyone can go see it, everyone can go find it, and that interaction becomes different because all of a sudden you have lots of people who aren't necessarily like a part of building that message board community, but they can just like sweep in and kind of say whatever they want. So in many ways it's not just a case that like, it's not like just a case of accelerationism where things have become faster. It's also that we now basically exist more in public than we used to be.
You were talking about the conversations we're having. We're talking even today with Brexit, the polarized conversations that we're having. Does that exist in Muslim communities?
Muslim
online?
Brexit, yeah.
Yes. And linked to that, it's always contested that there is a single Muslim community.
Right.
Muslim commons.
Yeah.
Is the internet the Muslim commons?
No, I don't think so, just in the sense that like, I feel because because like Muslim communities are so diverse and like their approach to things is very different, but it's not, you can't necessarily approach religion as if it was like a political issue. There's no like clear two sides. Like I was kind of thinking like what's the Muslim equivalent to Brexit, and I kind of think maybe like the prevent strategy, like the counter-extremism strategy might be, in the sense that like you've got your people who are kind of sort of pro it, but also people that are like kind of anti it. And I was like at the crux of that like a couple of months ago when I pulled out of the Bradford Literature Festival because they were like receiving kind of prevent projects, and I was getting a bunch of emails being like, you know, so you're siding with extremists, et cetera, et cetera. And this is from like Muslims themselves.
Right. So it's quite polarized.
So that sense is like, it's polarized, but like there's also lots of other things that are polarizing as well, right? Like, you know, whenever like, you know, whenever it's like the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, for example, like there is a huge debate over like whether you should be celebrating that or not. When, you know, Muharram, like, you know, the Shia kind of festival has just passed, and there's always debates about like, you know, is kind of like doing, you know, the chest beating like something that is religiously permissible, you know, or like should you just be fasting and praying, or should like you kind of be doing kind of like the rituals and, you know, the performance.
So what is the quality of that kind of conversation? Is it entrenching opinions, or is there some understanding that, okay, there are different types of Muslims out there?
I think there's both. I think there's like a lot of people, especially young people, who are kind of seeing that like these debates aren't particularly like conducive, and they've grown up in like the auspices of like 7/7, where they've sort of realized that like for them like Muslim is a very political identity. So for them like their, like for a lot of young people, like their priorities are much more about like security, and they're much more about, you know, being a citizen or something like that. But then you've also had people who are like, yeah, actually, like this conversation about like Muharram chest beating is a really important one, or this story about like whether you can like celebrate the Mawlid, the Prophet's birthday, is a really important one. And for me as a reporter, I kind of had to take a lot of this stuff very seriously. Like there's a chapter in my book where I talk about like this big kind of beef, like this like internet argument, you know, which involved a traditional Muslim scholar and an internet personality who was like had this huge following, and they were both kind of came from like a conservative end of Islamic belief, but their approaches to kind of very theological subjects, dense theological subjects, was very different. And the way that it played out was almost as if like this was like a boxing match. So like I would wake up and I would see on my WhatsApp, where I followed lots of these people, I would see like these posters of the Imam and like this internet personality. It's like, and I was kind of, you know, I wake up at like 4 a.m. seeing this figure. It's like, are they going to like fight each other, or like, you know? But actually, what they're doing is they want like a big theological debate. So for this group of people who want to practice Islam as purely as possible, and you know, their mission is to practice Islam as purely as possible because they think that like that is the thing that like God intended them to do. This is such an important thing. Right. So I think there's diversity in sense of like what Muslims in Britain see as their priorities and see as like the things that they should be worrying about. And I think that kind of was also testament to just how like diverse Islam in Britain actually is.
Sometimes it does enter into pointless conversations. I remember years ago, I don't know if anybody's following this, there was a music video that was created, a Muslim take on the Pharrell
oh
song,
yeah, I
Happy.
forgot about that.
God, that caused such a huge furore.
Yeah.
I mean, huge furore.
Yeah, I forgot
basically, background, pop song, happy, everyone is earworm, a bunch of happy, clappy Muslims, good for them, came together and did their version of it.
Yeah.
And oh my God, it created a huge storm.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was you know, that's also like a kind of another thing, because I remember during that time, it's like there were so many weird and bizarre arguments that were like happening. It's like, you know, is this a priority? Like, should we really be kind of like, you know, causing this much fuss? But also, it was like really low-hanging fruit, right? Yeah. It was like,
well, there was a tinge of politics in there too.
Yeah, of course.
As in the individuals there were of one particular point of view.
Yeah.
And those who are attacking were of another.
Yeah, I mean, it was like the very
some
kind of
people
like,
in the middle.
This is kind of where like the Brexit analogy, I think, kind of works, where it's like, oh, well, these are liberal Muslims.
So there are culture wars in these things.
Yeah, but I think like with religion, there's always been culture wars. And there have actually been legitimate culture wars where people have died in those culture wars, right? So I'm very careful about using that term, but I think with like religion, because it is one of those things where it's not just about politics, it's also about influencing culture and influencing society, then those kind of differences, whether they're theological differences or whether they are differences in terms of organization principles, they will automatically feed into culture wars. But what's happened in terms of the way that the internet has sort of developed in our time is that in many ways the existing Muslim culture wars, i.e. between liberals and conservatives, have sort of been integrated into new culture wars.
I mean, recently,
Yeah.
a few weeks ago, you had, I hope I'm not getting into trouble by naming people, but you had a very prominent American Muslim scholar
Yeah.
who's said something in Turkey supporting certain authoritarian governments, and a clip was taken where he was seen to be supporting it, and all hell broke loose between both sides. It was quite polarized.
Yeah, and like there's been various instances of this, right? Like that's a kind of theological thing between like being a quiet.
It was also politics.
Yeah, and there's also there's like a racial component as well, which was
Yes.
like is there like a race privilege because this kind of particular person is a white Muslim convert and one who is like of very high education, and one who also comes from like a very American context as well. So can he really be making these statements, and like what is his obligation to like the people of Syria or like to the people of Turkey and stuff like that? That's when we kind of veer into theology, but like the way that the internet kind of amplified that, so it became this huge deal because it became this thing of like either you're for him or against him, and maybe that wouldn't have been the case if we had like a less advanced form of the internet, or whether we changed our behavior to one where it was like, well, he can also be like fallible as a person, so his opinion doesn't just because he's an authority doesn't necessarily mean that he's right.
Staying with politics, in the book you talk about, you observe, as you said, that when at the time of writing, the internet morphed into, 2011, there was a huge conversation about the opportunities social media and the internet were presenting, especially when it came to the Arab Spring and the fall of authoritarian regimes. Fast forward to 2016, where the fear is there. How do you talk about the change? Are all the opportunities gone?
No. I think because the internet has. I still have a lot of faith in the internet, and I still have a lot of faith in technology as being a primer for like social good. And I think that there are like projects that are being developed, especially by people of color and women of color in particular, when it comes to things like utilizing blockchain technology, for example, to help like prisoners. You
were mentioning a mosque that was adopting it.
Or like mosque, or like accepting
donations,
like cryptocurrency, which I think is a little bit of like a fad, but like also I think is like a good way of like, okay, at least you're opening up to like the possibilities of technology. I think we're having, in technology space, we're having a really good conversation because, there was news that came out a few days ago about like Google employees in San Francisco, like unionizing for the first time. There are lots of conversations about like representation in technology, about like the overrepresentation of white men compared to people of color and like, queer people and, people of like other sexual orientations. And how that like, and when we're talking about things like racial bias or like bias when it comes to sexuality, like these are really important because we're talking about how, because technology is never going to go. And, so the question that lots of people are asking themselves, I was at the Labour conference on Monday, and like this is one of the things that they were talking about, which was like, how can we make technology for the people? Like, how can we make technology that works for the poorest in society? And part of that is like getting more kind of poorer people into the actual development process. But they also, there's also a big kind of argument about breaking up big technology companies, right? One of the issues that I kind of talk about here is like how so many of like the old kind of message boards communities that were being hosted by like various online platforms basically got like swallowed by Facebook and Google. So now if you want to like host an online community, you have to do it on Facebook or Google, or like some sort of like server that is powered by Facebook or Google. So there is that argument about like how do we break this up? How can we empower more people to have ownership in the types of kind of platforms that they're using to have conversations and to negotiate that identity?
You've engaged with trolls.
Yeah, too much. I've also trolled a lot as well. So like,
Okay.
I'm kind of not, I say to people like, this isn't entirely like not my fault.
How's that experience been when you engage in trolling?
Do you know a guy like made an 11-minute video about me the other day where he was like convinced, where he was, oh my God, it was bizarre. It was completely bizarre.
Go on.
Okay, so like I was on a fellowship in New York and I was really bored and it was 2 in the morning. And
This
I was
is
like, stuck.
for writing for the book, right?
Yeah, so this was in December. And I was like, in rural New York, everyone else is asleep. I'm awake trying to write. And I couldn't think of anything. So my brain went somewhere where I went on Twitter and I was just like, okay, I've got this really funny joke. And I'm going to pretend that like I'm a doctor who like can secretly convert babies to Islam when their parents aren't looking. And I tweeted this out and I was just like, this is so stupid. No one's going to get it. It's fine. I'm going to go to bed. And I wake up and I get like thousands of retweets and I'm just like, oh, like what have I done? I deleted it because it was like, okay, this is causing way too much chaos.
You weren't working for any organization at
I was
the time.
not working for
No reputational issues.
No, but like my bosses at the magazine, who are very kind of charitable to all the stupid things I've done, were kind of like, this might have been a bit too far. So I got rid of it. And but apparently it got screenshotted a few times. So a couple of months ago, this guy made a video of me on YouTube where he was just like, this guy is pretending to be this guy is a doctor. And he's like, we've got to find out what hospital he works at. And then like 5 minutes into this video, he says, I called my friend Kevin, and he's done more research on this guy, and it turns out this guy isn't a doctor at all. And apparently the research was like, a bunch of them just like went on my LinkedIn page, and they were like, oh, he's like a journalist, and like, he just like messes around with people when he's bored, and like is seemingly very good at it. So that was really bizarre. That video is still on YouTube, by the way.
Right, look it up, everyone.
It is really weird. I think it's really weird when people really engage with that. But in terms of like engaging with trolls themselves, I spoke about it in a very specific context. I don't know if any of you like read the stuff that was in The Guardian. But it was this guy who, again, this always happens when I'm really bored. This guy had been messaging me for like 2 weeks, and he had been messaging me with like anti-Muslim pictures and things and stuff. And I get it from time to time, so I tend to ignore it. But I knew that my editor was kind of like, you kind of have to talk about the trolling issue. And I was really struggling, so I was kind of like, well, I can just use like, maybe there's a way that I can use this data from like Tell Mama or like from the government and talk about how trolling is bad and why like, it's particularly bad on Muslim women who wear hijab and everything. And like, I could just do like a very straightforward chapter on it. Like, as you said, like I had to talk about extremism and I had to talk about that, and it was stuff that I didn't necessarily want to focus on. But when I was thinking about it, I was kind of like, well, actually, like, I don't really know who these trolls are. And I think, we're having, during this time, we're also talking about like the 2016 American election and Brexit and like how Russian bots were kind of being used to like troll people and everything.
And I hear there's Russian bots involved in allegedly stoking up racism, stroke anti-Muslim.
But also I think
Islamophobia.
that's like a way of, it's not the entire story. And I think actually a lot of these people are very real. And they're people who just like have kind of gotten onto Twitter for the first time and not quite sure how to use it. But they're, so they act like bots, but actually they're very, very real. So I was kind of like, okay, I want to meet this. Like, I just want to meet a troll. So I messaged him and I was just like, hey, what's up? Like, why are you sending me these things? And we ended up having this conversation over the next few days. And then I just thought to myself, like, well, he lives in the UK, so I should go visit him. So I lied to my mum.
Without any
in the audience
security.
Right now. Well, yeah, I told my mum I was doing some research in Birmingham, I'll be back, and like she didn't know any of this until the Guardian story came out. And she's here tonight, so like I'm very sorry again. Really I am. But I kind of, I was under the thing that actually like these guys are not actually that dangerous. They pretend to be dangerous online. And I had an assessment of him which was like, this is a guy who is very, very Christian, and like if I said to him that like I'm willing to convert to Christianity, like he would be very, very cool with me. So I kind of gave him that impression of, if you could convince me and like, change stuff. And I just had this conversation with him, and like I just spoke, and like I spoke to him about why he did these things and how it was like this mixture of kind of wanting to have fun online, but also this element of sincerity too. And this is what I was trying to talk about, which was for a lot of the time, people either kind of associate trolls with being bots, or they associate trolls with being people like me who just want to like cause a bit of mischief because they're really bored. And in reality, when it comes to this kind of trolling, like they use methods they employ methods which seem to be like just trying to cause mischief, but they do it with like this degree of sincerity. And the more people that do it with this degree of sincerity, then like those things become much more normalized in like just everyday discourse. So it's kind of these people who act with like that small amount. As you add it up, it becomes more sincere and it becomes more direct and it becomes more deliberate. So when we talk about like anti-Muslim sentiment, when we talk about, you know, Islamophobic trolling, but also when we talk about like anti-Semitic trolling, when we talk about, you know, trolling against women, for example, like it's kind of trolling within a very particular context. And it's worth, when we talk about, you know, when social platforms talk about safety on their platforms, or when policymakers talk about safety, like it's worth bearing that in mind, that like a troll in a very mischievous, I just want to cause some mayhem because I'm really bored sense is not the same as one that's like, I want to cause some mischief, but also like I am deliberately going out to kind of like target someone very specifically for a very specific intention.
Do you think there's any relationship between Islamophobia, the rise in Islamophobia we're seeing, and the trolls and the bots? And is there any relationship with the media? Or it's been debated. You've been at the front line.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think it's like, well, with the trolls
on both sides.
Well, it's all about like discourse and language, right? And it's kind of like how they all feed into each other. So, you know, I'm not surprised anymore, but like it's interesting and kind of quite scary to see that like you can read articles from like the Telegraph opinion section or the Spectator or something, and the type of language that they're using in those articles, like I've read from like bot accounts and troll accounts. You know, things about like, you know, civilizational decline and like ethnic replacement and stuff like that, like things that like are now part of like polite conversation. When we talk about trolling, like, you know, there was this conspiracy theory for it, and it was a conspiracy theory for a long time, but like, you know, George Soros like was causing all these things to happen. They were causing like the migration crisis and stuff. And then when you see it like being written by one of the Spectator's like leader writers, it's kind of like, oh, this language that like was once very much like it's a conspiracy theory is now part of polite discourse, because the Spectator is still a very formidable magazine in this country, and lots of, you know, policymakers and civil servants and politicians read it on a weekly basis and they enjoy reading it. So that kind of feeds into the media as well, which is, and you know, where it wasn't necessarily that I was asked like, you need to write kind of, you know, how, you know, this is like an Islam, you know, this is an anti-Muslim story. For them, like they kind of approach it with a degree of sincerity as well, but their framing is very off. So it's very much like, you know, they'll find an organization that is kind of linked to like a spurious, like conservative character, like religiously conservative character, and be like, well, this person is like an extremist, or this person belongs to an extremist organization. So automatically the story gets like reframed. And these people who are like, you know, and in journalism, I always believe that like you're writing about a person, and every person that you write about is complicated, and they have nuances, and like they also deal with conflicts of their own, and like you can tell better stories when you talk about those conflicts. And instead of like newspaper reporting and newspaper journalism, especially when it comes to things like religion and ethnicity, you know, and race and ethnicity and stuff like that, you know, editors almost lean towards like compartmentalizing and simplifying, because their thing is like, we want our readers to understand the story as simply as possible. And I feel like you know, when I went to journalism training school, like that was the thing, like you just write those stories as simply as possible, as cleanly as possible.
And does the Muslim internet lend to that?
What do you mean by that?
I mean, are there simple stories, you know, other than the trolls and the loudmouths and others?
Yeah.
You know, how do you convey the complexity of Muslim communities?
I think it's about like, sometimes things just don't belong in simple stories, right? Like sometimes they, you know, sometimes like, writing a story about someone in an organization, you're going to like reduce them, you're going to simplify them if you're like a news reporter. So then the job is like, well, maybe this is better written as a feature, or maybe this is better kind of presented in like, you know, and actually it's a hard question because I haven't reported on Muslim stories for like a very long time. So while I was writing this book, for example, like I was working for a think tank, so my job was to actually like commission and edit long reports and stuff, where the mission of that think tank was we want to present religion in the most nuanced way possible. And then I started working at a men's magazine, so I don't have to like write about Muslim issues anymore. And when I do get to write about them, like I get a lot of say in terms of like who I interview and what the story is, and we take a lot of time to like think about what that story actually is. So to kind of think about, well, how do you write about it in the context of like a news reportage thing? I have some ideas, but I don't really know. And I don't actually know if there is an answer. I guess like we're now having that question in terms of like, how do you write about other extremist groups? Like how do you write about like, you know, white nationalists, or even like non-extremist groups? How do you write about like eco-activists who kind of pursue non-traditional means of like direct action.
Going back to the book and the ordinary lives of British Muslims, one of the areas is love lives.
Yeah.
And you talk about dating apps and everything else. You know, it's a far cry from when our parents came and, you know, you introduced, et cetera, et cetera. We know the backstory behind that.
Yeah.
Walk us through that
It's
new
wild,
world.
It's crazy. Oh my God, it's insane. I didn't even like put all the.
Are you
like,
married yet? Or
No.
Okay.
But
are
like,
you using these?
well,
should I not?
I was.
Your mum's here, right?
Yeah, I was using.
Okay,
I was
sorry.
using it in the I was using it in the context of my reporting.
Right.
I wasn't like
not for.
No. I wasn't looking for anyone. God. But I was also interested in how like these apps worked because actually I had lots of friends who were using them.
Right.
And lots of my friends who were like
Muslim
women.
Tinder and
Yeah, like,
whatever.
and also lots of my friends. So like the story that there's a really one of my favorite stories is actually in this chapter where one of my friends let me third wheel on her date. And she knew that it would go really bad, so she was like, look, you should go to this because you're going to get some really good material and it'll be really funny. I was like, yeah, let's do it. So, you know, I kind of paint this very colorful picture of like what happens when you meet a guy on one of these Muslim dating apps and like they don't really quite know how to date or they don't quite know how to like hold a conversation. So this is a guy who like shows up really late. He doesn't necessarily impress her. And then at the end of the night, he's just like, oh, I'm late for this other date that I was supposed to be on. And it was just like, she was just like, oh, yeah, great, okay. And all in the meantime, like, I'm sitting in the corner just like watching and like eating kind of like, you know, like Bilal lamb, like on my own, in this very dark, like kebab house in like, in Swiss Cottage.
Interesting location for a day, okay.
Yeah, and it was a very, it was a really bizarre experience. But what I was really interested in was like, the guys at Muzmatch, for example, and they're like huge now. They're like, you know, they're really, really big, and they're expanding to loads of different countries. And I think
They claim they have millions. I'm not doubting it.
I wouldn't
I'm
doubt
surprised that they have millions of.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it because I think like when I spoke to Shazad, who like runs Muzmatch, his thing was like, look, marriage is like such a big thing in the Muslim community, regardless of what Muslim community you're in. Like every person.
I've heard about parents signing up for their
Yes,
kids.
yeah, and that happens too. Or like some parents are kind of like, you know, will be like the chaperone, and like the digital chaperone is a really interesting thing because they'll basically just like monitor their kids' conversation, and like to me that would be like a nightmare. I get really uncomfortable like knowing that my mum is like on Twitter and like she sees the stuff.
And these services account for
right.
that.
Right, and these but they're also just like, well, we know that there are some Muslims who like want to kind of have a traditional kind of arrangement, but they also can't find people in their communities that they can match to. So like, we're going to add this feature where you can do that. And the great thing about Muzmatch is that like, the great thing, but also the weird thing about Muzmatch is that when you first sign up to the app, you're kind of asked a bunch of these questions, and the questions that you're asked like, how practicing should your spouse be? What type of denomination should they be? Should they be wearing hijab or jilbab or like nothing? How religious are you? Do you not pray at all? And like in one way, it's not supposed to be judgmental. It's supposed to be like we're trying to filter things out so you're more likely to find your match. But when I was on this app and I was kind of just like, I felt a bit resentful because I was like, I don't really know what practicing means. Like, you know, because I wouldn't say I'm not practicing, but also I wouldn't say that I'm the most practicing Muslim. So like, if I put down moderately practicing, what will I get?
So
right?
as
What
an
will people
aside,
expect?
there was a few weeks ago, months ago, a polling apparently in the Arab world saying that Muslims in the Arab world are less practicing, and that caused controversy. Saying, well, that's probably because many practicing Muslims would feel that they're not practicing enough.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
and there's always that thing about you can always practice more. And also in the Arab world where like so much of like daily...
I diverge. Go back to your...
No, I think that's a really interesting point because like in the Middle East, like so much of your general day is structured by like Muslim rules. So for example, like you get Fridays off, right? Whereas in this country, like you have to kind of really make a conscious effort to be like, this Friday lunchtime I have to pray. Or in the Middle East, like, you know, often, or when I was working at the Islam Channel, for example, we used to get Ramadan off. Whereas now, like I work, it's like, well, like I've still got to work during Ramadan. So like, you know, there will be some days where I take days off because I just can't like work or like I'm not my best self. So what does that mean in terms of like how I practice? And I think we're also in this place where like recognizing living in a multicultural country and living in like a multi-denominational country that it's really like I'm not comfortable deciding who gets to be practicing and who doesn't. it's one of those. It's also, I think, a British thing as well. Like, I'm not going to ask you, like, you know, do you like pray your prayers every day and stuff. So, you know, you're often confronted with these questions, and you're kind of, it's almost like having an existential crisis when you see this thing. It's just like, oh, am I practicing enough? I don't really know. You know, should I be practicing? You know, I had like a real panic attack when I saw that, because I was like, oh, like, I know I was only doing this for research, right? So I think like that's an interesting thing, because I think it gets people to kind of really reckon with like who they are and what they want. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which was, you know, this is really like a search for identity, and it's a search for who you are. And like dating is like the most purest example of that, because in trying to find a partner, you're also trying to like find what a better version of yourself could be. Yeah, so I think that was like the most interesting thing that I found. But I think the story in that chapter is just hilarious. Like I love that. I love doing that like so much.
All right. Well, there's one reason to buy the book. In your travels, did you find differences in the way Muslim men and Muslim women, or is that too broad a brush to ask you a question?
Well, just
like
generally.
That? Yeah.
Are they different?
No, no, as in the way they engage with the social media and.
Yes. Yeah. I get you. I was just like messing around. Yeah.
That's all right.
Yeah, I think so. Like, there's one section where, and I think like Sheila and John Muhammad was like involved in this, where it was like when David Cameron made his speech about like submissive Muslim women, you know, and they started this hashtag campaign where they were basically like saying that, look, you know, Muslim women have achieved a lot, and like, you know, it was a grassroots-led campaign, right? It was like these women who were just really annoyed about what the Prime Minister said, and was like were using social media as a way of expressing themselves in a way that like maybe they hadn't sort of known before. And like I interview a woman who, like, for the first, you know, she felt empowered for the first time to be able to do this, because she felt that like in her real life, like as a Muslim woman, she was also being held back by her community to a certain degree. Like she wasn't kind of able to kind of get onto a mosque committee position, etc. So this was the first time that she could really assert herself as a person. And I felt that was like a very gendered thing of like, even when I was interviewing her, there were these kind of signs of like her restraining herself, or her like being very cautious about talking about her achievements in a way that like I have never experienced with like any of my interactions with like talking about men who are more likely to overestimate like how good they are. You know, there were other cases with like very specific issues with women. So like one of my favorite and most interesting stories was when I spoke to a young Muslim woman who used Tumblr, which is a social network which I think 70% of users are women, who use Tumblr to kind of get an abortion. And she found, you know, and that obviously, again, really, really controversial issue, but one where it was like she had to find another woman who would really be able to understand the emotional needs that she had. So it'd be like, you know, you need someone, like you need an alibi, like you need a story to tell your parents, you need to be able to kind of get here. You know, so she was speaking to another Muslim woman who basically helped her to do this. I think generally, like, what I found was like the majority of people interviewed in this book were men. And I found that really interesting too, because I reached out to a lot of women and I spoke to a lot of them off record or like in background about stuff, but they were very reluctant to kind of talk about more controversial element or like aspects of their faith that they felt to be controversial in case.
Did they give you reasons? Did they give you reasons?
Yeah, I said to them that I was looking to write a book and I really want to make it as gender balanced as possible. And they were very willing to meet me. But I think their thing was also, you know, a lot of what they said was like, if I give you my real name, or if I kind of identify myself and I say, this is why I'm feeling the way that I'm feeling, or this is like why I practice the way that I practice, I worry that there's going to be a lot of men who come into like my internet mentions or email me or whatever and tell me that what I'm doing is wrong. And I know that this has happened because this happens to me anyway. Like as someone who is very online, or like someone who like spends a lot of their time online, I've had men kind of tell me that like, you know, I shouldn't put my picture of my face online, or that I shouldn't kind of use swear words, or I shouldn't kind of tell, you know, I shouldn't be like online friends with men who are not, you know, related to me. So I just don't want to deal with that drama. And for me, it was like, okay, that makes complete sense. Like,
is that a phenomenon just in Muslim communities, do you think?
No, I think like it's kind of everywhere, right? Like I think, you know,
holier than thou.
Well, I also think that like, you know, you only have to be on Twitter for like 10 minutes to see like some guy like mansplaining something, right? Yeah. Or like, you know, there are tons and tons of articles about like men who like, you know,
the Haram Brigade.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the Muslim
Forbidden.
sense, I think they call it the Haram Brigade, right? And I think obviously there are lots of men who are very like resentful of that because they're like, no, like, you know, I'm just trying to give you a reminder and like, this is what you should do as a Muslim. And like, I'm not saying you should do it. I'm just like giving you a reminder, sister, and all that stuff. And, you know, you've all heard of this. I know all the smells and stuff. So yeah, I think, I mean, it makes sense because women experience the internet in a very different way to men, and women have a lot more pressures on themselves, both like socially and in terms of behavior monitoring, and also social media platforms that don't want to recognize that. So even in the context of like rape threats and death threats and violence threats and stuff, there have been activists who have been talking to Facebook and Twitter for such a long time about like you need to add in better protections to women, right? Or you need to add
that's
in,
generally specifically for Muslims as well.
Yeah, because like I think everything that affects people generally is going to affect Muslims as well, right? Again, Muslims are people, and like we shouldn't forget that. But like for them, like there are different things. So it may not, in like the Muslim communities that I was looking at, there may be less public evidence of, say, revenge porn, or or just like explicit images being uploaded, but there will be kind of more cases of like rumors going around. So like the story that I didn't put in my book because of legal reasons was a story about women who felt that like men who they had rejected for marriage were like spreading rumors that like they weren't virgins, or that they were like playing the field and stuff like that, and they couldn't do anything because like for lots of imams and masjids, like the internet is not kind of a territory that they feel is like on their remit. And you also can't go to court because it's kind of like, well, number one, court's expensive, but also if an anonymous account is doing that, then you can't prove that it's like this man. So things become really doubly difficult then, because there is this aspect of like this pressure of like you need to be performative, or you need to act in a certain way if you want to get married, or if you want to like appease a Muslim communities that for the most part are largely dominated by men and largely operate in a patriarchal way.
You were talking about support. The support requested of the technology companies, I guess, when it comes to bullying, etc. Do you think in Muslim communities there are support networks amongst themselves, or do they need to rely on,
There are definitely some support networks. So again, with women, like I like interact with lots of like women support groups, some of which are like now active organizations or active like groups
online
of people
support networks.
But they started as online things, or like they still exist like online, like so. I did a story about a Muslim woman who was like having problem like divorcing her husband, and because she didn't know the legal process, like she was an immigrant to the UK, and she kind of stumbled on this group, and like someone in that group basically walked her through this process of like, this is how you kind of file for a divorce, and like you need to just pack a bag and come stay with me, and like this, we're going to get this done rather than you staying in like a trapped and abusive relationship. So to some degree, like there are very direct support groups. Then there are other support groups. Like there are support groups for new Muslims, like converts. There are support groups for Black Muslims who have to like deal with like other aspects of like anti-Black racism within our communities. There are a growing like number of mental health support groups for Muslims who are like have depression and anxiety and stuff. And like unfortunately, like I didn't get to write about that because I kind of discovered a bit too late. But that would have been like, if I get to redo this, like I would have added that section too. So I think that's growing as like the need for more support networks and the need for more kind of emotional support grows.
Related to that, in your book you got a section on minorities.
Yeah.
And so I guess what constitutes a minority? You talk about Ahmadis, Nation of Islam, LGBTQ, etc. And are there within the mainstream? Are there minorities there as well? How did you approach that subject in your book?
Well, I knew that minorities were going to be like a section of my book. I wasn't sure how big they were going to be. And my mission was to kind of tell a more nuanced story of what like British Muslim identity was, and also tackle some of the more like controversial bits. So like I did a section of the Ahmadi Muslim community that like, there are still debates over like, should they be part of this book? Should they not have been? Should they have been? Like, do they classify in the context of British Islam? Like, I took the position that they did, just on the basis of culture, but also on the basis that like, these people identify as Muslims, so we should take them seriously. And I wanted to talk about how like old theological conversations and debates about like what classifies as authentic Islamic practice and what doesn't. Because so much about this book is about authenticity, and it's about people who are trying to kind of attain authentic versions of themselves. So I wanted to kind of talk about that in the context of like, well, what happens if you're a minority where like your notional identity becomes stronger as a result of being alienated? So for a lot of the Ahmadis, like they would say, well, because we're so alienated from the Muslim community, like I would not necessarily identify by myself as a Muslim, but I would identify myself as an Ahmadi Muslim. In the same way that there are Shias who like say, but I identify myself as a Shia first, and then like a Muslim afterwards, because I don't feel like I'm part of like mainstream, I don't feel comfortable to say that I'm part of the mainstream Muslim community. Or they'll say that, well, because my version of Islam is right, so I'd rather like call myself like Shia than that. And I wanted to see how like internet community sort of formed from that way of thinking. So with the Ahmadis, for example, like the support groups came from like this place of persecution or this place of feeling like under attack. So like they were forming these support groups almost as a way of like security, and how do they interact with like the outside world because of that. So for them it's like, well, we need to be on really, really good behavior, and we really need to act in like ways that are like much more charitable and much more open, so that way we can get the support from like the outside world, because that's what we need to kind of, that's what we need to kind of secure our place. And there are other, I speak about like racial minorities. So like the last section of the book is about black Muslims who talk about how even though they're kind of very sure about their faith, they also have to contend with a country where the majority of Muslims are like South Asian, or like in some cases they're Arab, and like they have, and they kind of say that, lots of Muslims kind of run away from the racism debate by kind of citing the story of like Bilal, the black companion of the Prophet, and like one of the most famous characters in Islamic history. And they kind of use Bilal almost like a scapegoat to say, well, because I identify as a Muslim first, I can't be racist, because all I care about is if you're a Muslim and if you're not. And it kind of ignores the idea that actually like racial bias can be exerted in ways that are like subconscious or like unrealized, if that makes sense. And how they use the internet to kind of form communities of like, black Muslim, the Black Muslim Network, for example, was the group that I was talking about in the book, who exist for the reason of like, to provide like a space for black Muslims to like talk and organize and to meet each other.
In your book, you presented the various characters. There's the Dawa man, who has a very big YouTube following. You talk about imams who are grappling with the internet, making themselves, I guess, more relevant.
Yeah.
Is there a question, you were talking about authenticity, is there in, I guess, traditional Muslim setups, when they deploy or when they try to grapple with social media, is there a quest for authenticity there, or are they, when we were talking about polarized conversations earlier, does that play out at all?
Yeah, I think any interaction with the internet is really like a quest for authenticity, because when we're online, we're always trying to be like a certain version of ourselves. If you think about like when you go on like Facebook or on Twitter or something, like you're acting in a way that like maybe you wouldn't do in real life, or you're acting in a way that like, there's this really funny story that I say that again didn't make it into the book. All like loads of good ones didn't, but it was about this guy that I met who he had like his social profile was like very, very religious. So his avatar was like Arabic writing. He would like post Islamic reminders all the time, and I messaged him. I was like, it'd be really good to meet you, because I just want to find out like why you run an account, which is basically just like an Islamic reminders account, and I'm writing this book about social media and Islam, and like this would be really good. So he meets me, and like I was expecting him to be like this bearded man in a thobe and like all that stuff, but he wasn't. He was like this guy who wore like jeans and like a baggy t-shirt, and like he looked a bit of a mess, and like he was like smoking, and you could smell like the tobacco on him. And I was like, I didn't expect, honestly, I didn't expect you to kind of be like this. And he said, yeah, I'm not really that religious. And I was like, well, why do you have a religious reminders account? And he goes, because like that's an aspirational version of myself. Like I know that I'm not like the most practicing Muslim, but like if I can do this online, then maybe, I'll use that as a way of like reminding myself. Like all these reminders that I tweet out, they're not just for other people, they're for me too. Because I'm not a perfect person, I'm not a perfect Muslim, but I strive to be, and that's the most important thing. So they almost like use alternative identities as a way of kind of being an aspirational version of themselves. And I think that feeds into the notion of like authenticity and people trying to be a better version of themselves, trying to be a better Muslim, and that happens regardless of where you come from.
What is the most surprising character you've met online or in your travels?
God, there was so many. I think the troll was still the most surprising
really?
one, because he was just so he was so like hospitable to me, and I was kind of like, this is super weird. Like I didn't prepare for this.
And what about your most surprising discovery then?
That's an interesting one. I think like the most surprising discovery was, okay, so like it wasn't necessarily a discovery, because I think I knew a lot of the stuff going in, but like when I went to Speaker's Corner, And I'd seen a lot of these kind of like Islamic speakers who had made names for themselves in that corner in Hyde Park. And I don't know if like you might have seen them on YouTube videos and stuff. They like have these big followings. And I was very, very intimidated by them because they were just like, oh, you know, these must be like really like big kind of authorities and everything. And I was very surprised about how insecure a lot of them were. I was very surprised about how like when some of these people were on camera, they would have like their own cameraman who would film them at like the perfect angle. And they would like, some of them like, one of them like face-tuned their face when like they were doing like a debate. And I was just like, that's
Sorry, what's face-tuning?
as in they cleaned up their face to get rid of the acne and stuff. And I was just like,
Or online, or
Yeah.
okay, not
Yeah.
just have a shave.
no.
Okay.
And I was just like,
Interesting,
you
I didn't
had
know
like spots and hair when I saw this thing and it's not there anymore. Like, what? Like, that's insane. And like, I was just surprised about how like so much branding goes into this as well. Like, and it makes sense. Like when I think about it, it's like, well, these are people who like make their big followings because so much of their like, you know, so much, you know, a lot of them don't have like proper jobs, right? A lot of them can't do their proper jobs because of who their internet personas are. And like, you know, there was a story about one of the big speakers in Speaker's Corner was like a trainee teacher, and he got let go when someone like sent a video to his school being like, yeah, this is a guy who like is saying that like, you know, homosexuality is like haram in Islam, right? So now he has
Forbidden, just in case.
so now he has to like rely on kind of crowdfunding and crowdsourcing. So his incentive is to like build his following, and like his, you know, it comes from like, you know, regular uploads. It comes from like setting up his own podcast. It's about making him look really good. You know, he has to kind of, you know, be a certain way. He has to like be very confrontational. Like so much about this is like an exercise in branding. And Speaker's Corner, which was once this very historic location where anyone was like a bastion of free speech, and where like people who were like free speech warriors kind of proclaim it as the only space where you can kind of say stuff, is now like this place where like influencers are born, right? Like in some ways being in Speaker's Corner was like the debates and the theological points don't really matter. What matters is how charismatic you are and how good looking you are on camera, and how like attentive you are to your fans and everything. And it was just like, if there was like an equivalent of your standard YouTubers that you kind of see and hear about in like the Muslim world, they will all be at Speaker's Corner.
I'm being told our questions are about to start. Yeah. I was hoping Hussein could read a passage from his book. He writes very beautifully. So
I'll do it very quickly because I don't know if we're running out of time, but
yeah,
okay.
Why not?
Okay. This is from the introduction. My call to war came at 3 a.m. via WhatsApp. A simple list of instructions, telephone numbers, and a list of what to bring on my journey. A warm jacket, extra pair of socks, hot water bottle. In the name of Allah, the most gracious and the most merciful, the message began. You will not regret this, and I'm so much happier than I ever was in Dar al-Kufr, the land of disbelief. So much more at peace. Follow me, Akhi, the message ended, addressing me as brother in Arabic, and I will help you make hijrah here. I had known about Abu Anta for a little over a year when he asked me to join his holy war in Syria. It was November 2015, and I was an ambitious young reporter, keen to make my mark in the cutthroat world of London media. As one of the only Muslim reporters working in a national newsroom, I had been assigned to cover stories about the British Muslim community, and in particular, the propensity for radicalization. For months, I had been trying to secure an exclusive interview with a British Muslim who had opted to leave their privileged Western lifestyle in pursuit of jihad. I saw this as the key interview that would prove my abilities as a reporter and take me one step closer to my dream job as a political correspondent with a desk in Parliament. At the time, in a media cycle that had yet to be touched by Brexit and Donald Trump and the rise of anti-globalism, the objects of national fear were Muslims, found in the estates of East London and in the suburbs of former industrial cities in the north. According to one British politician, thousands of Britons had fled to fight, quote, Islamist militias in Iraq and Syria. Although official estimates at the time were much lower, about 500 people, the migration still provoked an anxiety that Muslims in Britain weren't entirely loyal to their country of birth, that they were unable to integrate into society, and that Islam was not compatible with British values. I knew two Abu Antas, and both were defined by the internet. The first was the Religious Zealot. He was tall and lanky, a shadowy figure dressed in camouflage overalls, his face obscured by a black balaclava. His online profile pictures showed eyes so dark that they were close to black, and while little of his face was visible, you could make out the small ashy bags underneath his eyelids. He changed his social media pictures frequently. Sometimes there would be screenshots from passages of the Quran or stock photos of lions, a popular symbol among the young jihadis in the so-called Islamic State, who styled themselves as noble warriors for Islam. Other times, he uploaded pictures of himself. In some, he held combat knives and guns. In others, he sat in front of ISIS's black and white flag, holding up his index finger, symbolizing Tawheed, or oneness in God. This Abu Anta was exactly what you'd expect from an ISIS fighter. His social media posts were fixated on the importance of jihad, on how Muslims living in the West were, quote, lazy, materialistic, living in jahiliyyah, the state of ignorance. This Abu Anta would use his online platform to argue against other Muslims and refute, quote, liberal scholars who he believed were deceiving Muslims into fulfilling their duties. When questioned about ISIS, he would post quotes from hadiths supposedly justifying their actions, declaring that he was following the path of Ahlul Sunnah, those who adhere to the way of the life of Prophet Muhammad, a pure Islam that he believed wasn't tainted by the cultural traditions or Western adaptations. It was the path that he claimed that he'd been searching for his whole life, and one that he'd be willing to die for. The other Abu Anta I knew was a 24-year-old Londoner who told me he worked as a trader in the city's financial district, who passionately supported Arsenal Football Club. And as we got to know each other, he would tell me about his old life, riding glass elevators and donning Armani, Gucci, and Prada suits. He spoke about his client meetings on top of rooftops at exclusive bars in Mayfair and Kensington, and how multi-million cash transfers were just part of his average workday. I had it all, but I didn't feel good, he wrote to me on Telegram, another direct messaging app. I always knew that there was something missing. There were times when he would feel, quote, empty and isolated at his work desk. When he went to glitzy corporate events, he would sit at the bar, slightly tipsy, and feel, quote, a great amount of sadness. Abu Anta had pondered this deep-seated feeling of emptiness and concluded that there was more to life than just money and nightclubs. It seemed clear that the Abu Anta constructed this narrative of unhappiness, followed by a conviction and purpose to justify his decision to go fight in Raqqa. He claimed that he had left a life of luxury to fight for the sake of Allah. When I asked him about the specifics of traveling to Syria, he either refused to disclose details or he circled around the questions. Who were his connections? How did he cross the border from Turkey? Did he travel on his own? He only responded by saying that he had traveled by the grace of Allah. Despite missing parts of his old life, and more than once he asked me to update him on football scores and complained how he missed Whisper chocolate bars, he needed to believe that he was fighting for a bigger cause, to establish a true Islamic caliphate. He had spoken about the caliphate since he was a teenager, but not at mosque and madrasa or to his family and friends. Instead, these conversations would take place in the dead of night on internet forums like the Student Room, a popular message board of British university students. Other times, he would go to darker and more obscure online communities like Totsi and 4chan and eBombs World, sites which could openly be rude and degrading and even post illegal material like computer hacking guides and PDFs of the anarchist cookbook. On these forums, he would use the name Al-Sirat, and he would post long messages criticizing the British military involvement in Iraq, or, quote, George Bush's war for oil, praising al-Qaeda fighters as those simply resisting, quote, Western warmongers. To Abu Anta, the caliphate was the only way for the Muslim Ummah, the supposed global community of Muslims, to be united in fighting against Western imperialism. Other users of these forums laughed at him. Sometimes they would downvote his post, so his comments would be buried at the bottom of threads. Other times, administrators would report him, some of whom banned him from their forums for advocating, quote, harm and violence. But none of this deterred him or made him want to reconsider his beliefs. By the grace of Allah, I was right, and I knew that I was right, he told me.
Thank you. I think we're opening the floor to questions. Can I invite some of you?
Hi, so love the talk, it was great. I'm actually interested in hearing your opinions on, like, what's your sense, like, is the digital revolution, especially in the Muslim community, is it a positive thing or a negative thing? Positive in the sense that, you know, people are able to talk about taboo topics now, and gives them the freedom to, you know, find different communities that they wouldn't normally have access to, or negative in the sense that because it's anonymous, people can let their freak flag fly, so to speak. And it just kind of exaggerates the kind of notions we already have and makes things worse overall.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I believe in the positive power of the internet, and it's not just because I'm addicted to it, but also like because I think that a lot of the conversations that I think have really progressed in our communities have come via the internet. So like all these questions around like space for Muslim women in mosques, for example, like largely were driven, or like they kind of came into, they were forced, the conversation was forced when Hind Maki like put her Tumblr out with the side entrance Tumblr, which basically showed in visual terms how small a space women had to pray. I think for like marginalized communities like LGBTQ communities or other like persecuted minority groups, like the internet has really been this like safe haven, or this way of like being able to talk about like their existence and like their kind of Muslim experience in a way that maybe wasn't as visible or was sort of like marginalized in the past. So I think that like as the internet has kind of, as more people have been able to access the internet and been able to kind of have a voice, that stuff has been really useful. But at the same time, I think that like things like anonymity have brought like quite significant harms, both in a general sense of like Islamophobic trolling, but also in terms of very deliberately targeted attacks or being able to kind of say things under the veil of anonymity. And in that sense, it's less to do with like, is the internet a bad thing, more than like, what can the internet be? Like, how can it protect people? And this is where I kind of come into this thing of like, even though I think the internet as a whole is a good thing, the way that it's kind of structured where it's very kind of profit driven and very incentivized by money, and it's incentivized by like traffic and stuff like that. Like it's not a space that kind of provides conducive debate where everyone sort of feels like they have an equal platform. There is always like these power dynamics at play, and that feeds into a much wider conversation of like what roles and responsibilities should social media companies have as like social operators, and by extension, like at what point should we be talking about like how these types of profit-driven monopolies should be broken down. So I think the kind of questions about negativity come much more down to like how the way that we experience the internet is, how that's actually structured within itself.
Gentleman over there.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering, have you done any research on like, because your book's mainly about young Muslims and like their relationship with like social media and stuff like that, and how.
Yeah.
Have you done any like research on like the older generation, like people from immigrant backgrounds as well?
Yeah.
Who are Muslim, because and their relationship with Islam and also political issues as well, because I forgot what I was going to say now. Oh man. Oh yeah, because a lot of aunties and uncles have like, all the aunties are kind of, there's no space for them historically in the masjid and stuff like that. Yeah. And the uncles are like, they're working, so like they're working, or like they're busy with their families, so they're kind of like there's their main relationship with Islam kind of like on social media, at least in the case of like people who I know. I come from Whitechapel, so a lot of the masajid are like in Bangladesh, like the sermons and the talks and stuff like that. And so like for my dad, it's like it's just online. That's where he can get his.
This is your question about like how do you, like, why isn't there like why wasn't there more stuff about like how older generations of Muslims use the internet?
No, I'm just saying, have you would you do any research, or like are you going to do any research on that and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, I mean, there was one thing that I was thinking about, but
one more question.
Number one, and this is like a logistical thing, which was like, as a first-time writer, my publisher was kind of like, I'm not giving you more than this amount. So I really had to kind of be like, think about, well, what would I do with it? And the second thing was like, I really wanted to write a book about young people, and I really wanted to write a book about like, because this isn't necessarily just a book about Islam, it's also a book, it's also, I think, a coming of age book. And it was also like, I really want to write coming of age stories, or stories about people kind of going through these bits of conflict and how they resolve it at like quite a unique time for this country, and also for the notion of being a British Muslim. But I think that generally, like the way that older generations are kind of using the internet and like repurposing it, and how they interface like in Islam that has been taught and is much more cultural with new technology is like super interesting. Like even things like, even like really funny things like, WhatsApp, massive WhatsApp forward groups is like such an interesting topic for me. And I was considering putting it in. I think that had I been given more time, given more space, I would have probably done that. But I think that when my editor and I were talking about it, our thing was like, we really want to write this book for young people, so that young people can read it, and also for older generations of people to kind of understand what young Muslims in this country are going through.
Are you going to do any, because you were talking about the Middle East, and I think in the book as well you mentioned that you didn't want to cover it or something, or you were going to cover it at another time.
Maybe. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
kind of thinking about what I want to do next.
Yeah.
I'm really tired right now, so like
Yeah.
I haven't really been thinking about much. But like I've been kind of speaking to other places, so like
Yeah.
radio places and stuff about like how do we expand this project a bit more.
Mm.
Also like speaking to masjids as well.
Yeah.
I've really wanted to kind of like do more stuff with masjids in terms of like exploring this as a phenomenon. Because you know, like there's a unit in like the University of Cardiff which is dedicated to understanding how Muslims like understand the internet, and like a guy called Gary Bunt, who's a good friend of it, like a mentor of mine, who like runs that department. He has written like a very, very good volume on that. So worth kind of looking into that if like that's something that you're really interested in.
So, I'll speak to you later.
So a few more questions,
Sorry.
if you don't mind.
We can talk. Yeah, we can talk. Yeah.
Sorry, over here.
So you said that you wanted to be a political correspondent. Is that still something that you want? I guess what are you aiming for, if not that?
Have you seen Brexit? Who wants to do that?
Yeah. No, it's kind of. I don't know. I just want to go to sleep. I don't know. I think I didn't expect to be working at a men's magazine. I also like lowered my expectations a lot once I got into this industry. It was like, yeah, I'd just be happy with like any job that would pay me. So I'm still not in this place of like, do you want to be a political correspondent? I also don't think I really want to. I think while kind of like the Muslim stuff really I did think shoebox me and shoebox other people who were reporting on it. I also found that like I was really interested in writing about subcultures, and I was really interested in kind of exploring people who sort of exist on like the margins and who have to kind of create and fashion out their own spaces. And I find their stories like a lot more interesting and also like a lot more political, right? Because I think with like political reporting, it's very much like personalities like clashing with each other. But I'm really interested in finding out how do like policies and policy implementation, like how do they affect people, and how do they speak about it in the only spaces that they're really allowed to.
Lady over there.
Hi. At the beginning, you said how you were hired by Buzzfeed because you were the same identity of the people you were investigating. So I was wondering, to what extent do you think being the same identity as the people whose stories you're recalling helps, but also hinders you from being able to tell them in a particular way?
I think the one thing to bear in mind is that I wasn't actually the same identity as them, because even though I might be like South Asian, number one, like I come from an East African Indian background, and most of the sources I was speaking to were like Pakistani, right? So like I don't speak Urdu, so that's one thing. Like I'm not the same. And they also like a lot of the people I was speaking, especially when we were working on an extremism beat, you're also talking to people who come from like very poor parts of the city or poor parts of the country. Yeah. And I think there's like variation. So I think on the one hand, I don't think I was exactly the same, but on the other hand, like it helped in the sense that I could understand aspects of like the faith and kind of cultural elements in terms of why this person would act in a certain way, or why like their form of rebellion, for example, would have like much more would have like different cultural notes compared to say a white person who was like rebelling against their parents. So I think in that sense, like I was able to kind of make, and also because I had an understanding of the faith, an understanding of growing up in the faith, that I could interact with them and exist in places that like a white reporter couldn't do. So like, you know those extremism stories where, they'll kind of just like hang out outside a mosque, for example, like reporters, and like they won't be allowed in for quite obvious reasons. And there was like an extremism story that I was following where like I got into the mosque because like no one kind of suspected that like I was a journalist. Now there's like ethical implications there in terms of like, should I have done that? Should I have been like looking for people? But that helped in terms of like gaining access. And I think access is like a big thing too, because I think that like for lots of sources who distrust like mainstream media and they distrust like the classic like white BBC reporter, they would look at someone like me and they were like, well, maybe he would get it. Like maybe, perhaps not, but maybe he's more likely to understand where I'm coming from. And also this is with the context of the book, like this was also like how I was able to kind of get people to tell me things that perhaps no one could really see. So when my mission was like, I always want to like explore how British Muslim identity is expressed in different ways, I could kind of find like someone on a gaming forum, or I could find someone on a YouTube channel and sign off my email with like Hussein Kizvani, and they'd be like, oh, well, he has a Muslim name, so like maybe it's worth kind of responding.
And how do you think it might hinder you?
I think there can be like a degree of mistrust as well, because it can be like, oh, this person might have a Muslim name, but like whose side are they really on? Like, and I got a lot of interview rejections on that basis, where it was just like, well, you still work for mainstream media, I've seen that you like published on The Guardian and like the Telegraph and stuff. So like you still publish in these like quote Islamophobic places. So in that sense, it was almost like, well, I distrust you even more because you're trying to be duplicitous. And even though I wasn't, even though I was like being honest, and I was just like, well, I just publish in places that like publish articles. I think because there was so much distrust of media in particular communities, anyone who was like affiliated with like mainstream media space, especially if they had a Muslim name, would kind of receive a degree of hostility that perhaps other people wouldn't.
A quick question from me.
Yeah.
Do you see class and social backgrounds play out in your discoveries?
Oh yeah,
So
for sure.
example,
Yeah.
Without being too probably from a middle class background.
Yeah. I mean, I went to
whereas
grammar
from
school,
the-
right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I have the grammar school voice.
So,
Which is why like white people like me so much, right?
so how good was your streak?
Oh, I mean, I think like I had a respect for it. I think it was just like, look, here is who I am. Because I think a lot of people in my position pretend that like they know stuff.
Yeah.
Like I knew this reporter who like pretended to really like grime music once, to like try like go into like after the Grenfell thing, and they were going into other estates, and it was just like embarrassing. So I kind of just say that, look, I have some similarities to you, but this is like who I am as a person. I just genuinely want to listen to you, and I genuinely want to like hear your story. And if you don't have to tell me it, like there's no obligation for you to do, but I promise that like I'll kind of listen to it and I'll represent it as best as I can. So I think obviously like from first impressions point of view, like yeah, it does definitely affect you, but like the thing is first impressions aren't the only impressions. So then it just kind of means that you have to work a little bit harder to kind of gain someone's trust, or to like kind of say that even though I recognize we come from different backgrounds, like I will kind of treat you with respect.
On that
Thank you so
note,
much.
can you, before we thank him, here's a book. Please do go and buy it. I think it is one, if you're looking to understand the British Muslim community, this is one of the better books out there.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
And I'm not going to take the cut later. But please join me in thanking Hussein.